Hey, everybody, it is Matt Weaver here with Bible Truth Project. I am here again with Dr. Christian Widener, who is a independent researcher in biblical things. And we had him on our channel here a couple times, and it's really been interesting to see kind of what's happening. Of course, we're discussing this book, Witnessing the End. And in this, he basically outlines what is what could be a very significant discovery that has to do with the time periods that could be here between 2020 and 2027, ultimately going back to the decree back in, if I have the date right here, 1537, which matches this whole 70-year cycle or 70 weeks of years, and the Jubilee of Jubilees, if you will. So thanks for coming back on the channel here, Christian. It's always good to hear from you.
Thank you, Matthew. Appreciate that.
So let's talk a little bit. It's been, I think last time we touched base here was in the fall. And so we were kind of, looking at this timeline. At the first conversation we had, I think was the year previous, or maybe it was 2 years. And we had a conversation about this whole sequence, and you obviously developed it into an actual book. And we discussed that more at length last fall. It's been some months. Obviously, a lot of interesting things happening in the world. October 7th, this whole dynamic in Israel, this whole international pressure against Israel, the anti-Semitism rising, the nations turning against Israel, all kinds of things going on. So we're going to have a fun discussion today, but I kind of wanted to kick off this discussion by talking a little bit about something that Jesus kind of referenced in the Olivet Discourse. So one of the things that especially us in the West like to do is to really try to nail down time. And we're driven by time in the West. Everything's hours, minutes, days, months. Everything is very much dedicated to more of a chronological type of a time set. But there's actually different types of time that's mentioned in Scripture. One is a more chronological form of time that we're familiar with. But there is also a different type of time, which is a more of a season, where you don't necessarily look at specific days, hours, minutes, but more of the season. And Jesus references this in this parable of the fig tree. When you see the signs appearing on the fig tree, know that you're in the season, right? When you see the fruit of the season, you know you're in it. And there's this reference to season. And so in light of that, what makes this discussion, I think, very relevant is, even though we have ideas about maybe the chronological side of things, but so many people have been wrong before about chronology, there's some undeniable seasonal aspects here that we still have to reckon with regardless, even if we're still tracking with time. And I think you'll probably argue for that. Whether we are or not, we can't ignore the reality of what's happening on the world stage in regards to Israel, in regards to things that were predicted prophetically. It is safe to say that if we're not in the season, we're at least closer to the season than anyone else has ever gotten to in the last 2,000 years. So I guess talk to us a little bit about the timetable. Where do you think we're at in this whole master plan?
Yeah, so definitely we're in the season, right? And we have that concept even as Westerners. We differentiate between specific dates and it's my teenage years, or it's this was this in a decade or an era. We have kind of the same general thing, so it's kind of understanding which ones are talking about specific things. And Jesus gives us a very sort of generic reference when he says, when you see these things take place. And we can understand that because the budding of the fig tree, as we understand it, being the nation of Israel, happened in 1948. Well, I wasn't even born in 1948. So, so these signs in this season has been unfolding, for the last 75 years. Yep. And so that's coming up on 76 years. So, or we just passed, didn't we? I guess we just did.
76.
Yeah. So that's just past 76 years. So, so this is a long time by anybody's personal, scale. For the church, this is like, just happened, right? This is current events in church history of 2,000 years. And so if we see that, we go, yeah, definitely something's happening. Look what's going on in the world. The world is definitely in a transition. It's unlike any other time in church history when people thought that, maybe this could be the end, which there's numerous. I mean, from the first century forward, people have really hoped, this is our blessed hope. So everybody should be
Right.
really longing for the Lord's return. That's just
Right.
part of being a believer, and loving the Lord means to love his appearing. And actually, John Piper did a great book just making that point. Come, Lord Jesus. Like, how can we say we love the Lord and we really don't have any interest in when he's going to come back?
Mm.
Like, that's just incongruous concepts. Like, we love the Lord, we're interested, we love his appearing, we're interested in when he's returning, and that should help keep us watchful. But one of the churches that's warned about, hey, you're doing all this good stuff, but you've forgotten your first love. And think about that in the context of, you've forgotten maybe, a lot of things that might mean, but it also might be taken as you've forgotten to really look for the Lord's return. You've forgotten to really love the Lord and what that means. And so I think, I'd like to call people back to that, to how important it is to just think about, consider that this is a real event that's going to happen. Could it be in these days? And look at the signs that are going on. We're in that season, right? But then I came across something really specific, and this kind of, and it came from Daniel chapter 9, the prophecy of 70 weeks, which you referenced. And in it, it said, from the issuing of the decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until Messiah Prince, will be 7 weeks and 62 weeks, and it will be built again with plaza and moat. And as I was just researching things about Jerusalem and about prophecy and, would they rebuild the temple, I came across that Jerusalem had been rebuilt again in the time of Suleiman. And I presumed he had done that by decree. But what really blew my mind, besides figuring out that he did, was that the very two features mentioned in the prophecy were restored by Suleiman, and he put plaques at those two features. It says plaza and moat. So there's a big plaza at the Temple Mount, and there's a plaque up there that has, this was decreed to be restored by Sultan Suleiman, and it gives the date 1537. And there's also a moat around the Citadel of David, and it has a stone plaque. And first time, there is no documentation of anything about the plaza and moat. And even in the prophecy, it's strange. It says it will be built again or rebuilt again. And that opens the door for, is that saying that Jerusalem's going to be built again, a second time? But still, we have this prophecy. It says these two features. Today, there are stone plaques. I go, that's really hard to believe that's a coincidence, when the only time in history that we know that the plaza and the moat were restored was modernly, in the days semi-modern, 1537. Yep. So that set up this, could there be two 77s? And actually, I went back looking to really understand the first 77s. And most people think that only the first 69 weeks. And there's a way that you can construct it. If you reduce a year down to 360 days instead of 365, you can squeeze it down to 69 weeks. Some people will do that, but they'll use a little bit different way, and they'll get like, it was 69 and a half weeks were completed at Jesus' crucifixion. But actually, the simplest, most straightforward way to look at it, using just a plain solar year, 365 days per year, there was a decree by Artaxerxes in 458 BC to rebuild the temple and to restore Jerusalem. And 33 AD, when Jesus was crucified, is the best date for his crucifixion. People will argue that too. But
Yep.
when you look at those dates, it's exactly 490 years. So there's a real easy way to see, oh, we did get actually 490 years, but there's going to be a second one. Now, if all that was right, then you go, okay, well, what's 483 years after 1537? And that takes us to 2020. And if nothing had happened in 2020, I wouldn't be sitting here. I would just go, that was interesting coincidence, but nothing happened. But that's not what happened. In 2020, the whole world turned upside down. And we got this global you know, pandemic, the coronavirus.
Hmm.
Um, and I've made in the book the case that that actually looks an awful lot like what you might imagine a first seal from the book of Revelation, chapter 6, would look like. It talks about a rider with a bow who goes out and he wears a crown and he goes out conquering and to conquer. And so what we saw was this pandemic being used by the global government, initiatives to press forward a whole bunch of agendas that are bringing us towards a one world government. And that happened with deception and intrigue. And we had this aerial virus that's kind of like an airborne threat, like a bow. It wasn't that deadly, but it did go around the globe and it did shut everybody down. And it was called the coronavirus, which in Latin, corona is crown. And you go, so it's the crown virus. It goes through the air. All right, maybe that maybe could match. Um, but you've also got to have some kind of confirmation with the covenant. And so then I don't know what could that be, because we're in April, so I don't know what that could be. Maybe Trump's peace to prosperity plan in January, possibly. But then in the fall came the Abraham Accords, which confirmed the Abrahamic covenant. And for the first time, they were presenting a treaty that they wanted all the nations to sign, not just, a treaty between Israel and Egypt or Israel and Jordan like they presently have. They wanted to get everybody on board. And I'm like, oh, that looks like a confirmation of the covenant. So now we're talking about like looking and noticing a prophecy, coming up with, hey, this could be something, that there could be two 77s. And then now is it following the rest of the pattern of the book of Revelation or not? And what might we expect that to look like? And so far things have happened that to me continue to look like, hey, this could be, because the next seal is a red horse and he's given a great sword and the power to make men slay one another. And we go, okay, that's war. And right after the pandemic and right after things opened up a little bit, you started seeing massive increases in crime, murder rates going up around in cities all around the globe. And then in, I think, February of 2022, Russia invades Ukraine. And a lot of people immediately thought maybe that's like, Germany invading Poland. Is this going to take us into World War III? Now, 2 years later, it's hard to say that we're fully in World War III, but a lot of that kind of estimation has been circulating. A lot of people are expecting, yeah, maybe we are, and still in these early days. And it's a new kind of warfare. It's being fought on economic fronts and cyber fronts, and so it's not
Yep.
some of the true ways that we've seen war before, but a lot of people would say, yeah, maybe we are. Um, and then you've seen inflation and famine, which is the third horse, the black horse. And then, but they're like, yes, but the fourth horse is death, and we haven't seen a quarter of the earth die. And I would say, yes, I agree. But the other thing that not everybody knows is that starting in 2020, we started getting excess deaths from all-cause mortality. And what that means is statistically more people died than you would predict. And so, but in 2020, we started seeing in excess of all-cause mortality. And at first, people were just purely coordinating that with coronavirus, and just saying, oh, well, then maybe that's associated with the deaths from the coronavirus. But it's continued even after the pandemic, and it's continued across a variety of different things. I mean, there's increased cancer rates and heart problems and suicides and any number of different causes. But the interesting thing about that is just that it's up. And so that's consistent with an increase in death. And when we think about a quarter of the earth passing away at some point during this period of 7 years, because when we think about the first, any of the seals, when the first one is deception, when do we think deception is going to end? Not until the Lord comes back. Right? When do we think war is going to end? Not until the Lord comes back. And inflation and famine, death, all those things. So we see the things that persecution from the fifth seal, those things that are in the seals, we can expect to actually be ongoing throughout the entire period of tribulation until the Lord returns. And then in that period of time, you could expect then either a linear straight increase over that period of time, or what we often see is an exponential increase. So it's the hockey stick type curve, and most real processes act like that. So what I think we'll see is a small increase like we've seen now, subtle, 50 million, 30 million people. China hasn't even reported their numbers, so that's the whole other,
Yeah.
there's places like that that are black holes for data.
Africa,
That
India, places where data
yes,
is very difficult to come by, where the majority of
yep,
people live, really.
yes, right. So if you took just the numbers in the U.S. and you put them across the world, we're at least 40 million. And so like this is like a time of World War II, and it's a total silent. Um, nobody's talking about them. 1.86 million people even in the U.S. I mean, that's like 3 states. I live in South Dakota. That's like North Dakota, South Dakota, and Wyoming together gone. And so this is really it's really a big number. So it's a much bigger deal than people realize. So that's kind of okay, fine. That's consistent. But where's the abomination of desolation? Because now we're well into the second half, or let's say we're just starting the second half, depending on how you count your time. And I was thinking something maybe this fall, because I'm expecting that this 7 years would end in the fall. There's actually a Jubilee year that I think will begin in the fall of 2027. It's another reason I think that's that we're in the right time window, because there's also a period of Jubilees that correlate to the same time. But how could it be then the spring and we haven't seen an abomination desolation? And I was thinking about that, praying about that, meditating on it. And then I started thinking about, well, it should be just like the October 7th, except October 7th wasn't at the Temple Mount. And then I started thinking about that and listening to like sort of radical Muslim type sources, Jewish sources, non-Christian sources talking about October 7th. And they both said, or all the sources, that you'll look up on this, they go, yeah, the war is in Gaza, but it's not about Gaza. The war is about the Temple Mount.
Mm-hmm.
And that
Yep.
kept getting repeated over and over. It was
Yep.
called the
I picked up
Al-Aqsa
on that
flood.
theme. Right.
Yep. And so it was just like, wait a sec. And then they said they did one of the reasons they attacked Israel was because of the red cows, which was talking about the sacrifice of the red heifer, which was a lot of excitement about that potentially happening and what that might mean to fulfill prophecy and for it to indicate that the Lord's return was near. But then as I thought about that, wait a sec. So the battle, yes, it was in Gaza, but where's Gaza? Gaza is in the southern part of Israel, and they call it the Negev, but that's actually Judea.
Yeah.
So, and it's the corner, it's the border of the land. And Daniel 9 doesn't actually say that the abomination of desolation will come on the temple. It says it will come on the kanaf. It'll come on the corner. It'll come on the edge. And people assume, well, maybe is that on the edge of the Temple Mount, or the edge of the temple? What does that mean? Or is it the edge of the land? Is another possibility, but it's also against the temple, because that's what the war was fought for. So there's these ways that it's like, yeah, actually, it kind of matches what Scripture says. It just isn't where we thought it would be. And then if you think about what's an abomination, that's tougher. Like, it's idolatry, it's other stuff. But in Proverbs 6, there's a list of there are 6 things the Lord hates, 7 that are abomination to him. And so what did Hamas's attack do? Well, they devised evil plans. They ran swiftly to carry him out. They shed innocent blood. They did it proudly. They did it deceptively. They had lying witnesses and reporters who went along with them, and they
Yep.
took hostages to spread strife. And so I looked at that and I went, that attack fills all 7 things that the Lord calls an abomination in Proverbs chapter 6. So I go, so there's a check. Did it make the land desolate? Yes. And like I said, this attack came in what is Judea, and it caused all the people in that area to flee to the mountains of Israel, which is
Did
what we
over
read in Matthew
100,000 people were
24.
displaced.
Right. So you just go like, whoa. So we displaced people. It was an abomination. It made a desolation. It was on the Kanath, the border of the town. It was in Judea. It was against the Temple Mount. The battle was called the Al-Aqsa flood. And in Daniel 9, it says, and abominations, the end will come like a flood, and abominations are decreed. And so, like, wait, Daniel said the end will come like a flood, and they named the war the Al-Aqsa flood. Like, okay, that's an awful lot of coincidences that are starting to make this line up. And then now we have the chance to look back on this. And since the October 7th attack, what also happened in the world is this unprecedented, or just maybe not unprecedented totally, because we had World War II, but throughout the whole world, we've had this anti-Semitism rise up. And it's been crazy, right? Where did that come from? It began with October 7th.
It,
And then we've also had, well, go ahead.
well, I was just going to say it's surprising because it's the opposite. Typically, historically, the opposite almost happened to where most of the
Mm-hmm.
world would sympathize with Israel. This time, for whatever reason, Israel is really getting the shaft.
Yeah, yeah, and they did sympathize like for a very short period of time, but then immediately kind of turned their backs, and now you can see that this Palestinian conflict is really becoming a bludgeon for the world to sort of attack Israel with. Um, and so I'm seeing this and I'm going, I think this is matching, because in Matthew it says, that from the abomination of desolation will come a time of tribulation such as not has occurred since then nor ever will again. And so we're not fully, I don't think yet, but we've seen a movement in that direction that is bringing a time of trouble for Israel that has not yet abated. Um, and in fact, it doesn't look like it's cooling off at all from the latest Norway, Spain, and Ireland, voting, or stating that they're going to unilaterally recognize a Palestinian state. The pressure even within our own country. So it's a very serious kind of thing. But the problem with saying it was in the fall, for a lot of people, if they're thinking ahead, will go, well, okay, fine. But then where is the rise of the Antichrist, and where are the two witnesses? Because some people think the two witnesses should come in the first half of the 7 years. I don't. If you read Revelation 11 at the very end of it, and it mentions like now the seventh trumpet is coming, and so that kind of seems like the witnesses are there for 42 months, 1,260 days. That's the exact same time as the Antichrist rises. But it's kind of hard to say that we've had the Antichrist rising since this last fall. And so as I thought about that, I started thinking about the two calendar system that Israel keeps. And if people don't know about this, there's a first of the year that's in Nisan, and that's kind of like the religious year, and then there's the first of the year that happens in Tishri.
Yeah.
And Tishri is really the real calendar that's counted for the years. But there's this also, God has said since the Exodus, so for 3,500 years or so, the Jews have been keeping this double year, a year starting in the spring and then a year starting in the fall, that are running concurrently. And we don't really know exactly why, but it makes sense to me that that might have something to do with the last days. And then as I went back and started thinking about how this coronavirus pandemic started and the Abraham Accords, I went, hey, wait a sec. But we had this, like the seals start in the spring, and then we have this Accords start coming in the fall. What if we have like this redemption calendar that's starting in the spring from 2020 to 2027, and we have this judgment calendar that's going from the fall of 2020 to the fall of 2027? Could we have could God be doing things on two different calendars? Well, he's the one who appointed it. So yeah, I think he could be. So then maybe the 1,290 days for the abomination of desolation isn't really counting on the same schedule as the 1,260 days for the rise of the Antichrist. And so then that just it's set up.
Yeah.
These could be 6 months apart, not just 30 days apart. Um, and so then that would take us into the present. Um, and what's going on before our eyes that might be like a seven-headed beast with 10 horns. And I think the answer is the global government system that's rising up right before our eyes. So in scripture, we understand that a beast with seven heads and 10 horns is symbolic. Like nobody thinks that's literal. That it's not going to be some kind of dragon monster coming up out of the ocean. In fact, Daniel 8 tells us it's the last world empire. It's an analogy. It's a figure of the last, which will be unlike any of the others. And we're watching something exactly like what he described, which is a multi-governmental beast with many heads. We have the US, we have Russia, we have China, we have the EU, we have BRICS nations, we have a G7, we have a G20, we have all these different groups and associations, all these different heads. And you're like, yeah, but that's not seven. Okay, but seven is a symbolic number, and so is 10. And so if we understand that the whole image of the beast is symbolic, why don't we think that the numbers 7 and 10 are also symbolic? Why do we think those must be literal, but the whole image is symbolic? No, that like when we read about the seven churches of Revelation, chapters 2 and 3, we don't go, oh, there's only seven churches. That's it. No, we understand that seven churches represents all the churches. And so seven heads could easily be understood to be representing all the world's government heads, all these different bodies, all these different groups, all pulled into one beast. And many horns, 10 is also a number of completion. It's a number of like 10 toes, 10 fingers. That means all your fingers, all your toes. That can be 10 horns are just, which represent leaders or rulers, specific rulers, like the head of the WEF, Klaus Schwab, could be a horn. But 10 just means basically that all the world leaders are part of this beast. And people would go, yeah, actually, I think that's right. That it seems like almost all these world leaders are in on it
right.
to some degree or another.
If you have a G7 become a G10.
Well, you could do that too, but maybe it doesn't. Maybe it's a G13. A G17 doesn't necessarily. It just means everybody's there. And so this world government that's forming in front of us is becoming this giant beast that is ruling over all the kingdoms of the earth. And it doesn't have power the way we would have expected. Like normally, what you would think of is it's going to be one giant dictator who's going to rule everything, which is the idea of the Antichrist. Most people think about it that way, that there's going to be one person who's going to take power over everything. But if we got one person literally ruling over everything as one empire, wouldn't that be just like all the other empires that have ever existed? Why would that be different than previous beasts? But if we have a beast that has many heads and many horns, and the only one really truly directing everything is Satan, then maybe we have a beast with 7 heads and 10 horns that's like the dragon of Revelation 12 that has 7 heads and 10 horns. And that it's just not what we expected, but it actually it can match scripture, and it's happening. So the thing about having these decrees is people go, hey, you're just pattern matching to what you think. I'm like, well, I'm taking a prophecy that I think sets a border of time. I think it's like getting the outward part of a puzzle fitted, and that's constraining now my other choices for placing puzzle pieces. Mm-hmm. And so now I'm going, okay, if that's the right form, it's kind of like if all these different attempts to understand prophecy are all people are like creating a picture, like for the puzzle box. And then they're taking their picture and they're trying to put the pieces together.
Yep.
And so what these decrees do is they give us a unique puzzle box picture and border. And then I'm just saying, okay, can I fit all the things that are happening right now into that frame? And the more pieces that seem to fit, the more confident I am that actually these decrees really are telling us this is the final 7 years. And so I still need to see, who are the two witnesses? I don't know. So it's not like that there's these unknown, that I've got all the answers for
Yep.
this. But as I'm watching, I'm seeing things that are still continuing to match and follow this pattern that we've been given in scripture. And I'm very concerned that that's happening, and it's not really, I mean, some people are really watching prophecy closely, but I don't know what percent of the church is really watching closely and thinking, hey, wait a sec, we could just be a few years away from the Lord's return. But I think there's a lot of evidence to suggest that. And so, part of writing the book and even just talking about it, um, is trying to get people ready, even just to consider, hey, this could be this. We were told to watch for a bunch of things, and there are things happening that look an awful lot like all of the things we were told to watch for.
Some of the thoughts that come to mind. I mean, I've been thinking a lot, of course. I mean, you sent me an email with some of the time things and things of that nature. We've been talking with some of us at church, et cetera, just about the whole season and everything. And, could it be, might be, obviously time will tell. That's always the way it works. But there will be a
Mm-hmm.
time where it is actually true, whether it's this time or not, doesn't really, the end of the day, it comes down to it will happen at some point, and at that point, it will be true. Now, the I think what's really interesting, a couple, 3 months ago, something, there was another author, Travis Snow, who had tweeted something that kind of caught my attention. I'd been wrestling. I had laid the frame out of a book where I was dealing with the issue of the Antichrist versus false Messiah, because there's different conversations around this identity, and everybody's
Mm-hmm.
hyper fixed on an individual, one, and so it's
Right.
either a false Christ, as some would argue, or it's a false or an antichrist, as some would argue. And it was a little bit like, it was, how would you say, it was a little bit of a jolt to me to like stop and wait. What if it's both? Because it's both mentioned in scripture. And then all of a
Mm-hmm.
sudden, there are different pieces of the puzzle that, like, okay, well, look out throughout history. Israel has had kings, quote, that have been bad shepherds who have led the people astray, and there have always been opposers who have come in who ultimately are opposing what God really wants to do with an anointed leader in the land. And so you get this false messianic picture and anti-messianic picture functioning in the same time in many
Mm-hmm.
different cases. So why in the world wouldn't that happen? Jesus in the Olivet Discourse focuses on using the word pseudo-Christos. He doesn't use anachristos. Anachristos appears in the book of John, and that's great, but he doesn't use anachristos in his Olivet Discourse. Having said that, it is used in the book of John. So
Mm-hmm.
it's like, okay, context. So Jesus is sitting on the Mount of Olives talking to Jewish men, and his primary warning is warning against a Jewish, if you will, or pseudo
Yeah.
Messiah,
False
a false
Christs. Yeah.
Messiah, right? This false
Yeah.
messianic figure. But at the same time, he also says, but when you see Jerusalem surrounded with armies, run. And then you have this picture, and Paul addresses it with, this antichrist figure who's coming in with all signs and wonders as also
Mm-hmm.
being part of the puzzle. So all of a sudden it was like, well, it's both. I feel like the way it's portrayed, and it kind of, how would you say it? It was interesting because in another sense, you have in Revelation Beast 1, Beast 2. And I've heard a lot of interesting conversations about who's Beast 1, who's Beast 2, and well, am I false prophet, or it's people kind of ditch
Mm-hmm.
Beast pretty quick. Some say, well, it's Beast 1, then the resurrected, or but but all of a sudden it's like, no, there are actually two players that's mentioned even in Revelation in that context. So interestingly enough, in the age that we're living in, you have a very zealot individual that I think most of us conservatives would appreciate in Netanyahu, who
Mm-hmm.
is, if you will, we would probably say he's anointed by God to lead Israel.
Yeah. I
And
mean, just like
if
all the rulers, we recognize that they are appointed by God
so, all of a
for good
sudden,
or ill,
not,
ill, right?
yeah, and I'm going to be careful what I say here, but if he makes the wrong agreements with the wrong leadership in the region, he is a false Messiah. He is a that he could fit that bill. Let's put it that way. He could fit that bill. Now that might be a
Mm-hmm.
shocking statement to say. I'm not saying he is. It's just all of a sudden you have that. And then if you have another regional entity, whether that be Erdogan or, whatever, some king in the region rise up and build a giant coalition and gets Europe together with him and, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, it actually works. What I struggled with for years is like trying to see if it's one or the other. How do you make that
Yeah.
work? Because it looks like both you need it, right? But having said
Well,
that,
and
sorry, go ahead.
yeah, and to add on to that, um, I think that, and many antichrists have come, right? That actually I think, because we think about the way we talk about the Antichrist. There's a beast with 7 heads and 10 horns. He's the beast from the sea. And we go, that's the Antichrist, one person. And then the beast has 7 heads. One
Right.
of them receives a wound, and then the fatal wound is healed, and he comes back to life. And you go, oh, and that's the Antichrist.
Mm-hmm.
And then he has a horn, of the 10 horns that
Right.
has eyes and a mouth and speaks boastfully and
Yeah.
says monstrous things against God. And that's the Antichrist. Like, wait a sec. The Both the horn that we know represents a person, the head that represents a group, and the beast that represents the agglomeration, they're all one
Yeah.
person. Like, no, I don't think so. I think it's a group of people that are part of this system.
Yeah.
And I think that's why we have so many different, descriptions of the Antichrist. And we're trying to, smash them all into one person.
Right.
And you're like, actually, no, I think we've got tons of actors. And just as
Right.
we look at the world, that's what we see. We see a lot of bad guys. We don't see one bad guy.
Yeah.
And even when we say there's 10 kings, we know that there's going to be 10 bad guys running around.
Right.
And won't they all be worthy of the punishment that is said for the beast? That the beast, this whole beast, is thrown into the lake of fire, and we go, okay, that's going to be just one person? Actually, maybe not. Maybe God knows exactly who's part of that beast system and who deserves, to be thrown into the lake of fire for being, leaders in it. And I think that maybe is right. And this isn't something I would have seen. This is not even something I would have thought of. It's just because we're constrained to this time period with the decrees, and I'm looking at what's happening in front of us, and then I'm rethinking again about because we're all given these images of, everybody's agreed this is the right interpretation, and so we get stuck in those lanes,
Right.
instead of, like, just openly thinking about it, comparing it to what's going on, and going, hey, wait a sec, maybe that's not right. And so in that case, going back to what you said, yeah, we have lots of people who could be playing these key roles that we're told to watch for. And it's not just one, they're all working, they're all part of this beast system, or they're against it. Right. And that's going to be, that dividing line is going to start coming more and more clear if we really are entering the last 42 months. What I'm suspecting kicked that off was, there were some big meetings that just happened at the end of April. April 29th happens to be 1,260 days from Yom Kippur in 2027. So I started looking, what is there anything going on? Well, the WHO started meeting to approve this global pandemic treaty that a lot of anti-globalist people are warning will be, if that passes, it will be the beginning of global government. And it had a window of April 29th to May 10th that was supposed to pass. And it didn't. So people go, oh, see, it's not it. But that's not what happened. After the meeting ended, they just said, oh, that's okay. We'll just keep working on this because, we're going to pass it. They're going to meet actually in May 27th. So there's a big question about whether they're going to have finalized it by that time and push it, or are they just going to keep pushing it through regardless, of whether it officially passes. They're just going to kind of force it through. And then if they're forcing it through, then the date that they began to force it was April 29th. Also, the World Economic Forum met, they had a special meeting in Saudi Arabia, and there was a bunch of leaders that were talking about Israel and the Middle East and making some decisions. So there were 2 really key things that happened on that date, that I think, all right, we have to watch. Like October 7th, yes, everybody knew it was an awful thing that happened. It's in hindsight, though, it took me 6 months to look at October 7th and go, you know what? That really does match the abomination of desolation. And we had the hindsight to kind of really analyze the whole event. Um, in the very moment of something happening, it's not so easy to declare authoritatively, oh, that was the event, because we don't have God's knowledge, right? So we don't know. We have to go back and analyze and look at it and think about it and really test it and make sure it matches. So, so for saying for sure if 42 months started, that's going to be a process to really analyze that and make sure that that fits. But but because of all the other things that have happened, I think it's right. And I think I can see this whole thing starting to kick off. And then we're just in the very beginning stages of what is going to, declare itself. Now, if it doesn't, then it'll be kind of like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. You know, they believed God could deliver them, but even if He didn't, they weren't going to bow, right? If the things that we think we're trying to figure out about the Lord's return don't happen the way we thought, well, we're not the authority, right? So I'm still going to keep looking for the Lord's return, because look at the world around us. We know that the season is right. So these specific events, we're trying to match them up, and we can be wrong about that. But what's not changed in all of this time that we're watching, the world has just gotten more and more and more and more like what the Bible tells us the last days will be. The days of Noah, the days of Sodom and Gomorrah,
Yeah.
all that kind of stuff. It's just off the charts compared to any other historic time.
There's definitely a tangible sense of impending doom, even in secular culture. We're not even
Yeah.
talking biblical culture. There is, I interact with a lot of different types of people, and I ask questions, and people who wouldn't consider themselves religious, maybe spiritual or something or other, the like, we're on limited time, like we're borrowed time, like the earth is,
Yeah.
we're gonna, whether it's running out of resources or, and there's a general sense of we're coming to a head here in human civilization, and something is
Yeah.
going to happen, and that's just a generic sense. It's like,
Mm-hmm.
it's kind of like, whether, yeah, I don't know, I'm not sitting in all the world's meetings and understanding what's happening, but you can just take a little look and notice that all developed countries, for the most part, especially in the West, have massive debt bubbles. They have, entitlement systems that are extremely burdensome, and that unless you
Yeah.
reinvent the
Unsustainable.
way, yeah, unless you reinvent the way society works, at some point it collapses. It's not
Yep.
a, and this isn't a doomsday reality. This is something everybody kind of knows. It's just a,
Yeah.
well, how far can we kick this down the pike? And you have world leaders talking about this. This isn't just a fringe concept. This is a mainstream subject. Like, hey, we will lose our autonomy if we can't figure out how to somehow get debt spending under control, for instance. And it could
Yeah.
be 100 years, probably not 200. You know what I mean? It's like,
Mm-hmm.
okay, we got 100 years, at least I'll live, right? But we are not 3 generations away from having solved this problem without some kind of massive reset, to some degree. And of course, that's what world leaders are talking about. They even use those
Right.
buzzwords, the great
Yeah.
reset.
Absolutely.
How do we restructure society? Because at the end of the day, money is just an agreed upon value system. It's actually not worth anything. So technically, on paper, if you have a global agreement to reset currencies or things of that nature, it is totally possible. Of course, we don't live in the world of theoretical, but those are the conversations that very important people have, and are having, and it's a reality. But
Yep.
coming back to the prophetic side of things, the thing that I always look at is, okay, so I mean, I grew up in 80s, 90s. The type of prophecy conversations were very Cold War influence, right? And a lot of people, for whatever reason, there was a lot of predictions made that didn't end up coming to fruition. People said the Lord's coming back in 1987 or 1989, or
Mm-hmm.
and really from the
Yeah. 88.
1800s forward, from the 18 before 1800s, you don't read of that many predictions, other than God being so angry with the world that he's just going to destroy everything. But in the 1800s, you have this weird resurgence of interest, and so you have a lot of these fundamentalist groups we kind of come out of that. So Seventh-day Adventists are really a prophecy oriented group because Ellen White's prophecies, and it's they have those ideas. And there's the Jehovah's Witnesses, and there's all of these other kind of people who are a little loopy in the prophecy world. I guess that's my perspective. But then you
Hmm.
fast forward and you have the turn of the century, you have more thought, more intellectual thought on this issue. And then you have Zionism kind of bud, and then you have Balfour, and you have Jews starting to come back to the land. And then there's like this other layer, and then you have the Cold War, and every generation has kind of wrestled with prophecy. But what's unique about our generation is that um, I mean, in my parents' generation, Israel is established, but in our generation, you have in a parents' generation, when Israel was established post Holocaust, it wasn't an environment where you would say it was very, how would I say this, prophecy oriented. There was a lot of
Hmm.
wounds, a lot of hurt, a lot of, it was a generation who was empathetic, that it wasn't going to turn on
Hmm.
Israel. But give it enough time, even the Jews will tell you this. There's just this thing that sticks up its ugly head and starts to persecute them for whatever reason. And we happen to be in a time frame. I honestly thought I'd never see that kind of pressure come against the Jews in my lifetime. I figured it might take 3 generations,
Hmm.
but really in my generation, in America, the young people, the hate and the vitriol and the uh, anti-Semitism is just off the charts. It's not decreasing,
Yep.
it is increasing. And so now we're presented with a very interesting situation where you have Israel in the land with more Jews living there than anywhere else in the world. That's the first time that's happened in thousands of years. You have a growing Islamic community. You have, in some sense, a growing Christian community, even though in the West it's maybe diminishing. And so
Hmm.
something's coming to a head, and there's a
Yep.
clash of ideologies. I have contact with people who work, um, in various parts and in churches and different things, and I hear a lot of different things. But one thing that's interesting is that um, is just the growing forces at work. If you look at Europe, the mass migrants of Islamists who have moved in or taking over governmental
Hmm.
positions, things of that nature, is radically changing how those Western countries, their ideologies. All of a sudden, Jews aren't welcome there. Jews aren't welcome in Israel. Jews
Right.
aren't. It's just unbelievable the shift that's happened in the last 40 years from that regard.
And that's
Having
been
said
very
all that,
engineered.
yeah, and
Right.
having said all that, of
Yeah.
course, to me that shows that there is this common enemy. One of these unique images that we have in Revelation
Hmm.
is that you have the woman riding the beast. So in one sense, the beast is this, you get the sense that this is more of a structured, evil, global, whatever. But then you have this woman who's full of blasphemy and full of, idolatry and whatever
Hmm.
else you can come up with. And they both are working together to a certain point.
Hmm.
And you see that dynamic played out with the extreme right and the extreme left in these countries. They're both like, they're working together for this one common cause, death to Israel.
Right.
So it's, anyway, all of those motifs and images and stuff make sense in our generation. They didn't make as much sense in previous generations. It was much harder. Conservative culture, my parents, 1940s America, the rest of the world, there weren't a lot of what we would call super secular societies, even though you had communists and things of that nature. They were more
Hmm.
conservative
Right.
oriented compared to what we have now. So I don't know. Like, the part that makes intrigues me with your work is that you saw a pattern that, and you researched it well, that fits in the world we live in. That's interesting. That's not a lot of people that have come up with a more comprehensive theory for where we're at now. There's a lot of people who say, well, it whatever happens happens, and it's going to get a lot worse. Well, it's getting worse, and
Yeah.
it's not a time to be falling asleep. It's a time to understand we are seeing fruit on the tree. We are seeing signs. We're seeing interesting things. Could it be? I don't know. It may go another generation or two or three or four. I don't know. God is in control, like you said.
Hmm.
But at the end of the day, um, at the end of the day, we're in a unique narrative here that has not happened
Yeah,
for the last 2000 years.
it's
I guess to close this out, what would be some final thoughts that you have, things that you want people to know about? Obviously, your message is getting out. It's pretty crazy. When we started, it's like you had a few people and,
right.
100 of views, thousands. All of a sudden, you're facing hundreds of thousands of views, millions, maybe, or a million plus, maybe in one of those episodes. It's probably the dynamics changing for you. I'm sure requests are kind of coming in and you're wrestling with a different reality. But what would you want to leave us with? And for the next, let's say this year, what should we be looking for, and what should our attitude be?
Well, I would say that there's plenty of evidence to be standing at the door waiting for the Lord's return. That there's a lot of evidence that this is winding up in some reasonable time period, right? Now, whether that's 7 years from now, 3 years from now, 2 years from now, we're in a I think there's lots of reason to expect that it's imminent in that domain, right? Now it could be tomorrow because I don't know the day or the hour. I think we're in the time period that's more or less, it could come at any time. If people are watching this that believe in a pre-trib, they would call this just the birth pains, and they would still say, yeah, we could be. We're seeing the signs that
Yeah.
Scripture's told us to watch for. It's close. Some people are thinking 2030 is a better date. 2033 is a better date. What I'm putting forward is an argument that 2027 is got a lot of evidence for it, and I just don't think we're ready. I don't think people are ready to think that there's strong evidence that it could be that soon. And so that's really the main thing. Like if you really recognize that the Lord's return could be near, you're ready and you're thinking about that, you're hoping for that case. But the problem is that loving this present world is at war with our loving the return of the Lord.
Amen.
When we're thinking about all the things that we want to do in this life yet,
Yeah.
that cools our longing for the Lord's return. And so that's the warning, is really that there's a lot happening. I mean, people, my books are available to download free. So even the Temple Revealed and Witnessing the End are both as PDFs. They're just on the website. So anyone can go and endtimesberean.com, witnessingtheend.com, and download the books. Just get ready. Like, know what the prophecies say, know what's happening, know what else we need to be watching for. A lot of people have said also too about the abomination of desolation. They assume that means the Antichrist will set himself up in the temple of God and declare himself to be God. And I thought that too, because that sounds like an abomination of desolation. But when I looked really closely in Daniel and also looking about how Jesus talked about it, how Paul writes about it in Second Thessalonians, they actually are referencing different events. So there's this abomination of desolation, and there's the Antichrist setting himself up in God's temple, declaring himself to be God. The abomination of desolation needed to be in the middle. And actually, it was exactly 3.5 years after the start of the pandemic. So that was 3.5 years into this. The fall of 2023 was 3.5 years after the spring of 2020. So that timing was right, and that sets us counting forwards. And until now, that event successfully ended the attempts to do sacrifices. So a lot of people are like, yeah, but they got to do the sacrifices. And so, the other things that we might think about are just, if that's going to take place, maybe that abomination, that next temple piece, that might be then anywhere in the second half.
Well, I
It
think,
doesn't have to be. It
yeah.
doesn't have to
Well,
be
and
right at the very middle.
I'll be. I mean, I know, how would you say it, the Israeli position well enough that I don't think there would be any chance of a two-state without, like, the one bit that would probably get most of, especially the Orthodox, on board with a two-state scenario is if they were allowed to build a temple up on Temple Mount. Like,
Yep.
that's a legitimate bargaining chip that the Arab world could use to leverage the situation. I mean, it seems outrageous, but that's legitimate. If the Saudis, who have made some of those statements or alluded to some of that, like, okay, let them have that. Okay, let's say we let them
Hmm.
build a temple, Palestine, are you going to be okay with that? Can you get along with that in exchange for, and so people realize like that's a very legitimate possibility that is on the table and being discussed. And if that's the case, you're going to have a lot more buy-in in
Hmm.
that scenario than you do to just blanket, okay, we're just going to do it for the sake of peace, because they don't trust that. But if you have, hey, we'll let you build your temple, oh, that's
Right.
that's that's a and that's in the last since 67 hasn't been on the table. So
Yeah, but it could be, and will this two-state solution be, uh will that end up being and they will divide the land at a price?
oh yeah, well they already have, technically it's, with
Hmm.
Jordan, that's a division of land.
Yeah, yeah, it was
And
because
Gaza,
part of
giving
that
up
was,
Gaza, that's
yep.
giving up land. The Sinai Peninsula, that was
Hmm.
giving up land. They already have done some of that.
Hmm.
So, a little bit more isn't necessarily game changing if you understand that up till now, Israel has given up land that they sovereignly controlled.
Yes, and then and recognizing who are the forces behind that,
Right.
which is still part of this. The UN has been kind of a beast,
Yeah.
um, growing. The problem is that these things have been growing under our noses.
Yeah.
And so, it's hard to go, yeah, but we thought it would be something different than what's been, growing and developing right in front of us.
Yeah.
And maybe not, right? Maybe that's exactly what we're supposed to be watching for. It's just understanding the timing for when it really kicks into high gear.
Yeah.
And could that be now?
I mean, I will say in the last 15 years, I've changed my mind a lot about things, so it doesn't mean that my current positions are correct, but when you actually dig into it a bit, and I'm not one of those that's going to get really granular and really try to highlight on this day at this hour, whatever. It's
Hmm.
more, I'm more of a step back and take a general look. And if you start to see a puzzle come together, even at work with what I do at work, I'm wired that way.
Hmm.
I'm wired to see how things connect and see how things come together. And I'm like, okay, you can start to see a pattern. And that's what I see in this is that look, there is a pattern here. It's maybe not the final pattern. It maybe is the final pattern, but it's more
Hmm.
of a pattern than what we've seen for a very long time.
Yeah.
So very good. Well, I think that's it. Sorry, we had some internet issues. I think we got enough though that I can stitch this together. But thank you for coming
No.
on. It's always a good discussion, and I appreciate your effort, your diligence, and your work in this. I know that I'm sure you get it on both sides. People that love your work and people that can't stomach it. So the
Yeah.
critics
No, that's
abound.
fine. Yeah. It's for the Lord. So, you got to take all of it in stride.
Yeah.
um the good things are, it's just the grace of God, and the bad things, well, they're, if they were against, our Lord, they're also going to be against us, right? So either way, we shouldn't take it too hard, or let it go to your head either. So
No, because we didn't create anything to begin with.
no,
We can only
it's all God.
try to we can only try to put glasses on and somehow we can see it, but that's only by his grace. So
Yeah.
no, amen. All right. Well, thank you very much.
No, thank you, Matthew.